I was working on a project at Precision Lens Crafters, and it was 3:00 in the morning. We were on site trying to get live, and something went wrong. And the whoever it was, I don't remember who it was, she just had a meltdown. It was like, this is going to be a disaster. And she described the problem to me. And I said, back then we used literally transactions. So I said, change the N to a Y in column 54 on this transaction and run it again. It'll be fine. And like the power and the joy in those moments is something I've chased in my career ever since and never gotten close to getting.
This is the Rebel HR Podcast, the podcast where we talk to HR innovators about all things people leadership. If you're looking for places to find about new ways to think about the world of work, this is the podcast for you. Please subscribe from your favorite podcast listening platform today and leave us a review. Rebel on, HR Rebels. All right, Rebel HR listeners, extremely excited to have the discussion today. We are doing a special edition of the Rebel HR Podcast. This is a new Friday show, and we are joined by a wonderful guest, Larry Dunivan. Larry is a seasoned executive in the software industry for over 30 years. His experience spans the entire spectrum of activities in a software company, with the greatest emphasis on executive leadership, sales management, and product management and product development. Larry is currently the Chief Executive Officer of Namely. If you have not heard of Namely, I would encourage you to check them out. They are all about helping HR out with HR technology solutions and really targeted at organizations where there's maybe an HR team of one or a smaller HR team in a smaller organization. Provide some solutions to free up some time and make their lives easier. So thanks for joining us today, Larry.
Thanks, Kyle. I appreciate it. Glad to be here.
And really excited to dig in here. We were talking before I hit record. You know, I've been with the large companies. I've worked with a lot of different HR information systems, and really excited to kind of maybe nerd out a little bit on HRIS stuff. But before we get into that, I want to understand a little bit about your journey. What brought you into the CEO role at Namely? How did you get where you are today?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm always curious about how people end up in HR, because mine is a very well, I don't know how usual, but fateful, let's say, which is in 1984, I was renting cars at the Hertz rental car counter in downtown Chicago. 1982 was the worst job market for graduating students, perhaps in history. Maybe 2008, 2009 beat it, but I wasn't paying attention. And one of the women I worked with there had worked at Hertz in that office for over 10 years. And we became good friends. And she kept saying to me, you cannot be here for 10 years. Please do not stay here. And one day she came in and she said, my husband works for this company in the suburbs, and they do software, and they're looking for smart people to join and support. Are you interested? I'm like, I'm interested in anything that gets me off this rental car counter. And sure enough, he hired me. And it was a small division of what at that time was Burroughs, later became Unisys Corporation. And they served small K-12 school districts for student systems, financials, and you guessed it, payroll. And so I got hired the Friday before I started. He got fired, but I came in anyway. And luckily they didn't turn me away at the door. And that's how I ended up in the business. And for some reason, it just got under my skin, and then I just always found it fascinating. So I worked, in a lot of customer-facing roles for a number of years. Spent 10 years at a company called Cyborg, which most of your listeners are probably too young to remember. And that's how I got into product management. It was, your comment earlier about PeopleSoft before we got on today. PeopleSoft all of a sudden literally was cleaning our clock. And at the time I was running sales support, and they said, hey, can you help the development guy figure out what we should do about this? Because there was no such thing as a discipline of product management. And that's how I became a product manager. And then I actually worked from home for 4 years in the early 90s, which was not at all fashionable at the time, because I had moved to Minneapolis from Chicago. And when my children were born and I didn't want to commute to and from Chicago, I found the only HR software company that was based in Minneapolis, St. Paul, which is a company called Lawson Software. And I joined the company as the head of product there, and was there for 6 years. got a little burnt out in the software business and decided I was going to become a corporate CIO. So I went to work at Best Buy. Biggest mistake I ever made. Never, by the way, worked in HR or HR technology at all the whole time I was there. But, you learn things in life. And I learned that I really love the software business. And so Lawson came calling a couple of years later and I went back, spent 6 years there. And then at the end of that, I was running a small business unit. And I was really at that point in my life where I had to decide if I wanted to be a CEO. And I knew that there was only two ways that was going to happen because the product guy never gets the CEO job. So I either had to start my own company, which I've never felt inspired to do, or I had to lead a sales organization. And so early in my career at Ceridian, I had gone to the CEO and said, give me a shot at it. And ironically enough, the time I asked was a few days after the current sales leader had quit. And so there I was managing a 500 employee sales organization. And the closest I'd ever come to working in sales was doing demos and sales support. So did that for a total of 5 years in a few roles, and left the company ready to go start my career as a CEO. Had a brief stint at a company called Think HR, now Mineral, where I still serve as the board chair, and namely came calling in 2019 and recruited me to lead the company.
Yeah, that's a really interesting career path, and I'm just reflecting. We've had a few guests from the HR tech space on, and it's just so fascinating to think about, how much has changed. Technology has changed in general, but gosh, how much has changed since the 80s in HR tech to now we're talking about how do we ensure, your video conferencing systems allows for, streamlined integration with your, with your HRS. It's like, that was such a figment of a dream, back in the 80s and 90s. So you are a trendsetter. You were working from home before it was cool to do so. So
yes, I was.
I think you should put that on your LinkedIn too.
There you go. Well, and I always joke that, I've lived through 3 complete reinvention cycles of HR technology. First we had, we actually got to use a terminal where you could actually visually see anything instead of mounting tapes. Then PeopleSoft came along with, a client server and a legitimate user experience. And then came the cloud, which most people associate with Workday as the biggest innovator. But really what Workday did was create a great next generation HR system, which happened to be deployed in the cloud, and I can with great confidence say I will not be here for the 4th.
Well, good for you. I think you've probably earned some rest and recuperation after going from turning wrenches to CEO. But what a great story. We didn't talk about this in the beginning, but we do use Think HR in my organization. Now it's Mineral. So, great platform. We were struggling a few years ago to try to figure out how do I take care of some of these virtual trainings. We need something, and we ultimately went with the Think HR as a solution. It's been great. It's super, it's super easy to use. If I can use it, it's easy enough to get users and stuff in there. And now I've got somebody that's fortunately better equipped to handle it. But yeah, great product. So
and it's a very interesting space, especially as it relates to technology, because one of the things that I did a lot of work on when I was there, and I work with the new CEO now, is this notion that you can integrate systems with content. So the example I always love to use is when you hire your 100th and first employee in the state of California, guess what? Your world just blew up. Do you know it? And what do you do about it? And how powerful will it be? And this is some of the vision we've been working with them on, is how phenomenal it would be that when you hit save on that 101st employee, you got this whole avalanche of data telling you what to do, how to do it, and hopefully maybe even just doing some of it for you. That's a whole aspect of what's going on in technology that's all greenfield.
I love that vision, and it fits so cleanly into, my context of what I think HR can be, I think about like the compliance aspect of my job. And when I started in HR, it's been not quite 20 years ago, but I worked in an organization that was fairly evolved in HR information systems, where there was a trigger that somebody needed to make sure that somebody needed to take a lunch break, because in that state there was a lunch break compliance law. There were dashboards to track some of the KPIs that really mattered. But then I went from that huge organization into a smaller organization that was 20 years behind, in their HR functions, and it was a completely manual. We have this training spreadsheet that we have to make sure people get done. Make sure you remind them to do it. Put it in that Excel document. We forgot to hold our annual standards of business conduct training. Shoot, we need to do that. We're 6 months late. And there's no system reminding us to do it or helping us be proactive with it without having somebody manually manage it. And then I think about, there's such a robust opportunity here to take some of the administrivia out of HR's job to free up their time to focus on the stuff that my guess is the CEO really cares about a lot more. Retention, employee engagement, picking the right people, career development, all of these things that I think in HR, we kind of think are maybe a little bit squishier, but they also aren't necessarily as urgent because they're not as front and center as like payroll processing and compliance, requirements and things of that nature. So as you have taken the helm at Namely, tell me a little bit about what your focus is, and how are you coming to the market to help out HR professionals?
Sure. It's a great question. It's interesting because one of my hesitations about joining Namely was that I had worked with enterprise clients, pretty much from the start of my entire career, large companies. And Namely does not serve large enterprises. Namely's focus is on companies typically between 50 and 500 employees. And so one of the things I had to do from day one is completely rethink my mindset about what a customer does, how they operate. Because, I could make an argument that says, I've been inside the head of, HR users from a technology perspective, as well as anybody, you might find. But in fact, not the case at all in terms of this target customer. And what I like to say is the only time that our customers understand is just in time. And why do I say that? Because none of these customers have people around that are experts in the software, that are there to go to with a question. None of those people have any experience with what it means to configure software. They often, and they sure as heck don't have time for it. And so what I learned right away and what we doubled down on is how do we serve that customer the best way possible? And the way to do that is to find what I like to refer to as the perfect mix of simplicity and functionality. Enterprise class systems will give you 1,000 ways to do activity X. And when you have a person that's an expert on how to configure it, they consult with your user, you should choose option number 530. Our customer cannot possibly live in a world where there's 1,000 ways. So I have to pick the 25 ways that will best serve the customer and then make it super easy for them to choose that option. Ideally, even just telling them what to do and suggesting it and doing it for them if they say, yep, that's what I want. So for us, it's a very different dynamic. And our competitors are still trying to be all things to all people. Let's be honest. In this market, the investment community loves the company that goes end to end. You talked about ADP earlier. ADP is an end-to-end provider with 5 different platforms, 5 completely different, unrelated platforms that they do a great job of migrating customers to as they grow. There's nothing wrong with that story. But to suggest that ADP can provide a path for that customer from the time they have 5 employees to the time they have 5,000 is an absurdity.
Yeah.
And so for us, what that means is we graduate customers to Namely on lower end products as they grow out of it at that usually 50 to 125 employees space. We're also eyes wide open that when our customers get to 1,000 employees, they're very likely going to graduate away as well because I didn't provide support for those 1,000 different ways. And so maybe at a time and place we'll aspire to that customer, but we're not going to. You look at the other companies in our space like ADP, the Pays, they want to carry those customers forever. And actually, I respect that. For a company of our size, that's not a realistic option. What it also means, though, is we can then provide what I think is a very unique, specialized experience, ranging from, great user experience and ease of use that employees love, to doing a number of those processes themselves. What's unique about Namely is we offer a managed benefits solution, which includes benefits brokerage. We offer a managed payroll solution where we actually operate it for the customer. So that client that's growing fast with 1, 2, 3 people in the department can take on all the important stuff that makes a difference. To your point earlier, recruiting, retention, employee experience, performance management, compensation. We'll do all the back office benefits and payroll stuff for them until they get big enough that they see value in doing it themselves. And then we're happy to turn it back over to them.
We'll be back after a quick break.
And so used to having everything in front of them right away that we forget that innovation just takes time. I myself, I get frustrated too. Why? And this as being one of my best friends is, hey, I talk to you all the time. Hey, man, I'm frustrated in the fact that I can't seem to just get there in the next day. But that's just not how these things work, right? Innovation needs to be planned out. It needs to be very methodical. And then when it finally hits, that's when it seems like to everyone else that it sort of just came out of nowhere. But to you, the amount of dedication that it took over that time.
That's really interesting. It's fascinating to talk with you because usually when I'm talking about an HR system, I'm talking to somebody in sales, right? And it's every every shiny penny reason why this is the best system ever, right? It's really refreshing to hear your perspective and I think the integrity and honesty to say, listen, this is who we serve. This is our niche. This is what we do, and we're going to do it really well. And I can just tell you from my perspective, when you made the comment, 25 ways, not 1,000 ways, I've felt that deep down in my soul, because I can tell you, I've been with the big companies, and the tools themselves, you can do so much. You can do almost anything you can dream up, but to actually get it to do what you want it to do can be extremely painful. And I can't tell you how many situations I've had where I've had, usually it's some poor payroll person on my team who's working through a problem and works the problem for weeks, thinking they're doing the right thing, and finds out, oh, there was a better solution over here, but I didn't know about it. I was, and the poor rep who was helping me through it didn't know that this is actually what I wanted to be done at the end of the day. And then it's crap, redo it. It'll take another 6 weeks.
Yeah. And there's 3 people in the company that are familiar with anything close to all 1,000 of those ways.
Right. It's all about you got to get the one, I call it you got to get the guru. One guru who came up from the bottom up and actually helped build the structure of the system. And, but the problem is that person's probably promoted 17 times since last Sunday because they're so good. Actually getting him to do something for you is impossible.
Yeah, back in my cyborg days, this was in the 80s. I was working on a project at Precision Lens Crafters. And it was 3:00 in the morning. We were on site trying to get live, and something went wrong. And the whoever it was, I don't remember who it was, she just had a meltdown. It was this is going to be a disaster. And she described the problem to me, and I said, back then we used literally transactions. So I said, change the N to a Y in column 54 on this transaction and run it again. It'll be fine. And the power and the joy in those moments is something I've chased in my career ever since and never gotten close to getting.
And that's probably why you're CEO right now, because you knew, the no to yes, right? You were the guru.
yeah, I was for sure.
Yeah, I think it's a great approach, and as I think about, I kind of reflect on my journey, and there's so much that I could focus on in my job. I mean, you feel this, right? I mean, it's what is HR? you asked the question earlier, how do people even get into it? Well, I tell people HR found me. And for me, my skills are I'm an extrovert. I like people. I like to think about strategy. I like to try to get people aligned with the right roles for them. I love recruiting. I love development, all that stuff. But if you come to me and you're like, okay, you also run, you have to run payroll. That's like, I'd rather watch paint dry than try to figure out how to do like time and attendance structuring. So I've been very fortunate that I can always rely on others. But the other big challenge with that is I'm also accountable to make sure that it's correct. And if it's not correct, you better believe that's on me. So just because I don't enjoy it or don't necessarily understand it as well as my payroll person sitting in the office next to me, I'm still accountable. And that's where it's kind of this constant tug of war for HR leaders to figure out, okay, what do I actually focus on? What do I have time to do? But how do I make sure I don't miss anything? And I think that's what's wonderful about the platform here. So one of the things that I was curious to talk about is, what is your approach to the service model? And I've been through this a couple different scenarios here, but how do you really differentiate yourself as far as making sure that your clients have the best experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's interesting because when I joined the company, we had just moved our call center from New York City to Atlanta. And let it suffice to say, if there's any namely clients listening, they will remember these days if they've been around for a while, because it wasn't pretty. And the first thing I did was I actually, I stole some concepts that we had implemented at Ceridian, because one of the challenges with service, as I said to you earlier, the only time they understand is just in time. I've got a problem. I need somebody that understands it. Please, God, help me quickly. And on that, and that has a number of dimensions. First and foremost, show me how to deal with it right in the app. And we work really hard to do that well. It begins and ends inside the product. Back my comment earlier about balancing simplicity with depth of functionality. But then you ask the question, well, where do you go from there? And so one of the things we did early days when the company was a startup, which of course customers loved, is they had a named contact. They called the person for anything. Direct phone call, reach out to that person. Hi, Joe, it's 3 a.m. I need your help. Mm-hmm. Never sustainable. I still have clients asking me to bring that back. But what we wanted to do was try to find an intersection there that worked. And so we built something we refer to as the pod model. So we create pods of customers. Those customers have unique characteristics, typically number of employees, also whether they're using our managed products or not. And then there's a team of experts that exclusively serve that group of customers. So a couple things happen. We may have, we have 75 people in service. You're only going to deal with a handful of them, 5, maybe 10 of them on a regular basis. They get to know the client, you get to know them, you get trust in them, they develop an understanding of what you need. So you get some of that personalization. But the beauty of that also is the world doesn't fall apart when that one person takes the week off or gets sick. In addition, we've invested very heavily in the Salesforce Service Cloud. And have built a portal, which customers love to hate because, people still would rather just get somebody on the phone in 3 seconds. But we've built some really great technology and invested really heavy in knowledge base articles that are easy to find. So when you search for it, and then what we do in the background is we track very carefully exactly what they're doing to find the answer to the problem. It refines the search results, but more importantly, it gives us input into how we change the product. Or when we see something that requires attention, we use a tool called Pendo that actually puts a message in the app. So let's say that we watch the same customer after a release have the same 5 problems. maybe they found the knowledge base article, maybe they called us. What we do is we go right in app and put the warning that says, hey, if you're trying to do this, don't forget that this is what you need to do. We call it case deflection, which I hate because it's so uncustomer friendly, but it really is powerful. The best case is the case the customer doesn't initiate, whether it's on the phone or in our case management system. So it's a multi-tiered process, and it's taken us to a place where we have world-class transaction support surveys at an average of about 6.7 out of 7. You can't really get any higher than that. And it's worked well for us. It's not perfect, trust me. Any number of your listeners are listening to this and saying, service sucks, whether it's namely or otherwise, because service is the number one reason why customers leave as well.
Yeah.
And so all you need to do is, especially our customers, is have a really bad experience that's employee facing, and the CEO or the business owner is like, I don't give a crap why you like or don't like, namely replace them. And by the way, barriers to exit are low. It's you may not be able to do that with 1,300 some employees. You can't wake up one day and do it. Our customers actually can. Do they want to? No. Is there value added in doing it? No. So we pay a great deal of attention to that. When a customer leaves us, it hurts.
It's funny you mentioned that because I have floated to my payroll and benefits specialist, who's like she's the HR person. I'm sure there's probably a lot of people listening right now that can relate to this. She's the person that started as an accountant in accounts payable, ended up getting thrown payroll her way like 20 some years ago when there were only 60 employees, and then grew to have to run payroll for 600 and just did it all. And then going, hey, that system you used for the last 20 plus years, we're going to change that. That's a switching cost for me that I that's pretty expensive, because I think I might have to help her work through that. So, but
I've worked with many of those users in my career.
Yeah. And God bless them. I mean, seriously, exactly. To my earlier comment, it's like, that my sweet spot is certainly not that role. And I certainly didn't go to school for accounting. So, I'm blessed to have been able to work with her and many other wonderful people with similar backgrounds. It's one of the interesting things I like about HR is it's like you get to use both sides of your brain, right? You get the left brain and the right brain, and you're trying to clump it all together in this storm in the middle of your head as an HR practitioner.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories from the old days when I was doing implementation work was that opportunity when the customer would be like, your taxes are wrong. And they'd say it like it was a statement of fact. And it could easily have been somebody doing it for 20 years. And back in those days, we were actually dealing with customers who owned and maintained their own payroll systems. Like they had in-house IT people building it, and they were wrong 100% of the time.
Yeah.
And so, but I would have to show her, and so I would geek it out and I'd do all the calculations. Those days are over for me, but I can go there with anybody, which is pretty powerful as a CEO, to be honest. It does help build credibility with customers when things aren't going so well.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, and I'll maybe a cautionary tale or maybe something to think about. Hopefully nobody's doing this, but many years ago, I was working with a system that was it was not one of the larger systems, but it was kind of a homegrown, kind of like this Frankenstein monster of a payroll time and attendance system. And we had a DOL visit, and one of the questions in the DOL visit was, "What are your rounding rules?"
Oh, geez.
And the honest answer from the individual at the location was, "Well, I have no idea what that even means. What do you mean rounding rules?" And most of us understand there's very specific rules on how you can round time. Well, sure enough, one of those rules was off by 1 minute, and that resulted in a multi-year look back from the Department of Labor.
Mm-hmm.
And we had to go make it right. And you know what? At the end of the day, what it was it was not malicious. There was no malintent on anybody's part. It was one number in one system on the back end of some random payroll system that was structured probably 20 years prior, and nobody ever looked at it ever again.
I've been through that too.
And it was, and it was corrected. But that's a situation where it's like, if you're in those small organizations and I just told that story and you're sitting there and you're thinking, I don't know. It's probably time to start thinking about how to systemize, how to leverage expertise, you don't have to do this all yourself. So
Yeah.
I learned a lesson. I learned rounding rules. I tell you that.
There you go.
All right. Well, I think maybe the only other question I wanted to ask is, I want to talk a little bit about just kind of the workplace disruption and maybe peel back from the system and talk a little bit about your role as a CEO and as a leader. And as you have been leading an organization through one of the more disruptive years, or year and a half at this point, since we've been going through the global pandemic and we've seen a shift in working attitudes and working relationships, how have you approached the challenge of, kind of culture retention and keeping the team engaged and focused on the number one goal? How have you tackled that?
That's a great question. I'm very proud to say we have, super high employee engagement scores, which I'm very proud of, but they haven't been easily attained. I think the most important, I've been on a very personal journey for sure, especially as we saw things like the murder of George Floyd, which for me was, and my daughter lives a mile from where that occurred. So not only had work-related, but personal-related implications. Obviously, helping people kind of navigate life in the midst of a pandemic, completely changing the way we operate as a business. And I think for me, the part of it that's been the most profound is, how I've had to evolve as a leader, become much more proficient as a listener. I think I have some natural empathy, but it has never been more critical or more vital in helping an organization in difficult times. And then I think perhaps most importantly, and this is just more my nature, I don't really hold back. People don't really need to know how I feel. Don't get surprised by how I feel. And I think that was powerful in helping people feel safer and respected. Ironically enough, our turnover didn't spike, but it didn't go down in spite of our very high engagement scores. And that's been okay too. And then lastly, I think the thing for me that's been the most interesting is being a voice for those customers for whom their CEO doesn't get it. I've been shocked by how many times I've done, I've done some live stuff and have made the statement like, listen, customers, I hear you. It is not easy to deal with your CEO. And you have got to give them a wake-up call sometimes, knowing that it might not work. But the CEO coming to you and saying, hey, deal with this Black Lives Matter thing for me, okay? Which is happening all the time, is so wrong. It outrages me. And especially for our target customer, but it's true everywhere. There has never been more a time where a CEO needs to be hands-on in supporting, coaching, mentoring, and leading their HR leader in this time in our world. And unfortunately, there's a lot of CEOs that just don't get it. I hope more have discovered that. Time will tell. Maybe somebody will survey them someday. It'd be an interesting research opportunity. But maybe more than what it's meant for our company, because that's actually been pretty smooth. I'll take a quarter of the credit for that. How it's affected our customers has been more surprising and more almost frustrating, more distressing, let's say.
Absolutely. And I think really, really interesting insight, and I'm sitting here taking furious notes, but, starting with yourself and your own personal leadership and listening and empathy, transparency in communication, and then, to focus on, some of the cultural challenges that we're facing. And I think, maybe can end the main discussion here on this point, the call to action to CEOs, senior leaders, as an HR professional, I truly believe that's one of our primary jobs. Maybe our most important job is to speak truth to power and to help our leadership team understand the challenges that we face and the fact that this isn't an, quote, HR issue. This is a business issue. This is going to impact the entire organization. This isn't something where, HR can, HR put out a COVID policy, so we're COVID safe now. And you know what? Don't worry about how people feel about masks or vaccinations. We've got this policy. It's fine. You don't have to worry about it. Well, wrong. DEI. Well, that's an HR thing that, we feel good about that because HR put out a flowery announcement on MLK Day. Well, it that doesn't count, right? It's got to be systemic, and it has to start from the top. So I appreciate you for championing that and for sharing that. And I think call to action for all the HR folks listening. How can you do that in your organization? How can you foster that feeling? So, and you could probably shoot Larry an email. I'm sure he'd be happy to talk to your CEO too.
Larry@namely.com.
All right, we're going to shift gears. I'm fascinated to hear these answers. We're going to go into the Rebel HR flash round. So, all right, here we go. Question number 1. What is your favorite people book?
So the one that I love is Ancient. It is 25 years old. It was written by Herb Kelleher, the CEO of Southwest Airlines, about, at the time, I actually pulled it up to read how they describe it. Southwest Airlines' crazy recipe for business and personal success, which was really about just treating people really, really well. And now it's like the biggest thing ever. I get exhausted by these long LinkedIn posts about how I'm taking control of my work-life balance. I'm taking care of my children. I mean, yes, I recognize there's companies that didn't support that for decades. I'm not one of them. I've managed my work-life balance just fine, and I'm a workaholic. But I loved that book because it was so funny and so insightful and so powerful and still relevant for culture today, even though it's, quite dated and quite a bit irreverent.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, it's a great story. And I have not read it. It's it's one of those things where I've read, how many, LinkedIn posts and, there's been allusions to the book, but I have not actually sat down and read the book. So it's
a fun, easy read. It's very readable. It's like junk. It's like, a trashy novel, but leadership.
Sounds good. All right. Question number 2. Who should we be listening to?
I am one of those people that has paid less and less attention to the universe as I've gotten older. I'm less interested as a learner. So honestly, my answer to you is your inner voice. I've spent a great deal of time in the last year during the pandemic doing mindfulness training and meditation training, and have learned that, so much of what you hear around you affects your ego or how you see yourself or how you want others to see you. Yet your inner voice is the one that is the most powerful. And you can feed that inner voice with learning, which is great. And that's how I would answer your question.
I love that. It's fascinating that that's your response, because there has been a common theme as I've been interviewing. I've interviewed about 100 people for this podcast. And I get this question quite a bit where people are like, how do you deal with all the stress and how do you handle it? And my honest answer is I'm just a host. I don't know, I'm still working through this myself, but I can tell you what some super, super smart people tell me. And there is a consistent theme that it is about, like you said, connecting with your inner voice, meditation, blocking out some of the emotions and noise, and really focusing on, what is true. And that seems to be a common theme from some super smart people. So thank you for sharing that. Last question, hard-hitting question here. How can our listeners connect with you?
Yeah, like I said, Larry@namely.com. Easy. We'd love to hear from. I love it when people reach out to me after these kinds of events. And of course, if you're interested in Namely, that works just as well too, and I'll get you in touch with the right people.
Absolutely. And just so you guys know, Larry's legit. Like on his LinkedIn profile, he literally has his email address in his about me. So like it's out there.
By the way, says for customers.
It does. So,
I had to beat up a salesperson who reached out. I said, no, it's not for you.
And again, if you want to learn more about Namely, it's namely.com. Super easy to remember if you're in the market and thinking about it or frustrated with your current system and want to understand some other options. Great platform. Larry, thank you so much. It's been an absolutely wonderful conversation. You're super busy. I just sincerely appreciate your time today. And thank you for sharing some of your knowledge and wisdom with us.
Thanks for having me, Kyle.
Thanks. Take care. All right. That does it for the Rebel HR podcast. Big thank you to our guests. Follow us on Facebook at Rebel HR Podcast, Twitter at Rebel HR Guy, or see our website at rebelhumanresources.com. The views and opinions expressed by Rebel HR Podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any of the organizations that we represent. No animals were harmed during the filming of this podcast.
Baby.